Hello and welcome to episode 25 of the Monday Night Review. It is 35 minutes past 7, which is bath time in my house, so it could get really loud, but I've just had one of those days. I'm trying to actually work like a grown-up at the moment, rather than just kind of floating about the house in a panic of procrastination and indecision. So I've been quite effective today, but podcast just didn't get made. In fact, because we're moving, the new tenants came to look around our house, and I didn't think it would be that appropriate for me to be reading what I'm going to be talking about today. Today's episode is pretty horrendous. It comes with all kinds of trigger warnings. It's a recent case, it's ongoing, it's horrible. So if the true crime aspect of this podcast is not for you, then this is an episode to skip. And I wouldn't blame you, because today we're going to talk about the Bedsit Murders. This case, in terms of how the murderer was discovered, is kind of like our British version of the Golden State Killer. In terms of he's been tracked down using discoveries in familial DNA years after the event. This was one of the UK's longest unsolved murders. Obviously, Jack the Ripper is going to beat all of them, but in terms of fairly modern murders, this one was one that was actually on my list to cover before recent events happened, so that's kind of weird. So it all starts on the 23rd of June 1987 when the body of 25-year-old Wendy Knell is discovered in her bedsit on Guildford Road in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. Wendy worked at a Super Snaps and had been at work that day. She went to the bank after work and then went home. Later that evening, she went to her boyfriend Ian's house. She spent the evening with him and his mum watching television, and then at about 11 o'clock, he dropped her off at her ground floor bedsit. He kissed her goodbye on the doorstep, and in she went. He would never see her alive again. The next morning, when Wendy didn't show up for work, Ian was contacted by staff at the store, and so he went to the Guildford Road bedsit to check on her. What he found when he arrived was the scene of unimaginable horror. Wendy was lying dead, savagely battered, and had been strangled to death. She'd also been brutally and savagely raped. In fact, a pathologist, Dr. Nat Carey, re-examined the original investigation later on and found that Miss Knell was abused on the point of death or after death, which is going to tie in with what we're going to talk about later. Police believe the murderer broke in to the bedsit via a back window that could not be secured because the latch had been painted over. So during their search, there was no sign of forced entry and no one in the neighbouring flats had heard anything. So at some point that night, Wendy was sexually assaulted, beaten and strangled and was left naked on her bed, covered by a duvet. So during the search, it was established that Wendy's diary and a distinctive keyring were missing. The keyring, which was a souvenir from Austria, had a small brass cowbell attached to a multicoloured key fob and a brass plate with Woman of the Year engraved on it and 2 keys. They've never been found. They did find some evidence, and forensics managed to recover trace elements of semen upon Wendy's body, and so they were able to recover a partial DNA profile of the killer. They also went on house-to-house inquiries and discovered that a few days before Wendy was murdered, a 19-year-old female neighbour of hers was warned by a strange man not to leave her windows unlocked. The police circulated an e-fit of this man, which does look surprisingly similar to the suspect. A muddy footprint was also found on the blouse lying on the floor of her bedsit. Now, we've got a picture of this, which you can see either on the new website or on our social media. In some records they say blood, in some records they say mud. It's just a partial footprint, which you'll be able to see for yourself. And it's from Clark's, which for anyone not in the UK, that Clark's is a very famous shoe store. It didn't match any of the shoes owned by Wendy, Ian, or Wendy's family and friends, so they believe it belonged to the killer. It was also not a very well-known trainer, so it shouldn't be hard to identify once they found it. So it's determined that it's a murder by an unknown intruder, and so everyone understandably feels really uneasy, but there's nothing happens for months, and for many, life just returns to normal. That is until 5 months later, on the 24th of November 1987, when Caroline Pierce is about to become the second victim. She had gone on a night out with friends and was dropped home by a taxi at around midnight. She's wearing a long black skirt and a red jumper, and it's believed she was attacked outside her home. She also lives in a bedsit, but it's believed that the attack took place outside her home. The neighbours reported hearing a scream, but when they looked out of the window, they didn't see anything. But when Carolina failed to arrive at work the next day, her concerned family reported her missing. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that her naked body is found 40 miles away by a farm worker in a dike in a remote field near St Mary in the Marsh. She had also been sexually assaulted, beaten and strangled. Her keys with the Buster Brown's restaurant fob where she worked have never been found. So why were they so convinced this was the same assailant? 20-year-old Caroline also worked on Camden Road. So where Wendy worked was the Super Snaps on Camden Road. Caroline Pierce worked in the Buster Brown's on Camden Road. They both lived alone in a bedsit about a mile away from each other. Though there's no indication that they knew each other, they both went to the same cafe on Camden Road, so they probably knew each other by sight. But the strangulation was the same, the beating was the same, the taking of the keys was the same. So the investigation ran out of leads. It was never forgotten though, and in 2019 a reinvestigation was boosted by an enhanced DNA sample from Caroline's tights. But the breakthrough really comes from a sample from Wendy's body. So I think they did a number of crime programs on this, and they just kept getting no results. There was no witnesses, nothing new, and they keep trying the DNA, which gives me hope for anyone who's just in awful circumstances. It's reassuring to know that they keep on testing the DNA. Checks on the national database showed a close match to 90 people, and then police detectives were able to whittle it down, eventually finding the brother of, and then hospital electrician David Fuller. The match was 1,000,000,000 to 1. So on the 3rd of December 2020, the police carry out a dawn raid on David Fuller's house. When he's arrested, he denies knowing either of the women, but when his fingerprints are taken, as he's booked in, they matched one found in blood on a plastic bag found in Wendy's bedsit, and they find photos of him from the 70s and 80s wearing the distinctive trainers that match the footprint found at the scene of Wendy's murder. He's familiar with the area where Caroline's body was found because he went there on bike rides with his cycling club. And his diary shows that he visited Buster Brown's where Caroline worked, despite saying he'd never heard of it. What's really fascinating about this horrible man is he completely documents his entire life. So, as we're going to find out, nothing he doesn't document, no matter how horrendous it is. So David Fuller, not unknown to the police, he'd been to court a few times between 1973 and 1977 with multiple creeper-style burglaries. He was convicted of 23 of them in 1973 alone. He shows particular skill in breaking and entering whilst people are in, and it's possible that he broke into Wendy's bedsit, as there's no sign of forced entry, and then just lay in wait for her. And it's believed he waited for a long time outside Caroline's bedsit before she came home. He seems to be very adept at sort of creeping about. But it gets worse. Worse than 2 sexual assaults and murders? Oh, yeah. During a search of his house, this is in December 2020, and home office, detectives find over 30 mobile phones and SIM cards, hidden computer hard drives, CDs and floppy disks with more than 14 million images of sex offences, including footage of him sexually assaulting dead bodies in the morgue at the now closed Kent and Sussex Hospital and the new 500-bed Tunbridge Wells Hospital in Pembury, which replaced it in 2011. Several hard drives were found attached to the back of a chest of drawers, and officers found handwritten diaries and a little black book in which Fuller had written down the details of all his hospital victims. They ranged from a girl aged 9 to a 100-year-old woman. He also had one of the biggest child pornography stashes ever discovered by the police. This guy is absolutely horrendous. But a lot of people are asking, how could this happen? How do you have the time to do these terrible assaults on dead bodies? Well, he worked as a maintenance supervisor in these hospitals, so he has legitimate reasons to visit the morgue. He can be checking the temperatures of the fridges, checking that the lights work. He's a trained electrician. And so he has his own all-access swipe card, which means he can get in anywhere. And then a couple of papers have shown a layout of the morgue, and it's really easy for him to go in unseen after hours and avoid being caught. He's able to enter through the clinical office, and then, which means he'll go unnoticed by a porter, and then he goes into the mortuary from the other side of the fridges. There are 5 members of staff who usually work 8 till 4, and he used to work 11 till 7. So his attacks would take place in the 3-hour window in the later part of his shift. So although obviously people die outside of those hours, what happens is they will get brought into a sort of receiving area and placed into a fridge, which is then locked. But on the other side, the fridge is open into the post-mortem room, and that side is not locked. So he was able to go in through the office, round the back of the fridges into the post-mortem room, where the fridges were unlocked and there is no CCTV. Now, understandably, there's no CCTV in the post-mortem room, which is a usual practice to preserve the dignity of patients, which I completely understand. There's quite a lot of anger on the internet about this, but I completely understand because, frankly, you don't expect someone to be doing something this horrendous. So he knew that there was no CCTV, and if anyone came in to deliver a body on the other side, he was unlikely to be caught. They're very unlikely to come round to the post-mortem room because they would be just delivering the body to put into the fridge for the doctors to look at the next day. So the stored images found by detectives only go back as far as 2008, but Fuller has worked in the hospital since 1989, so they believe there could be hundreds more victims. Now, one thing that's always been a bit confusing about the Bedsit murders was there were 2, and if you know anything about true crime and murderers, they're either going to be a one-off crime of passion, someone you know, a wife hits her husband around the head with a frying pan because she's had enough. But the Bedsit murders were linked, they were 5 months apart, and then they just stop. And that is very unusual. Usually killers don't stop, they escalate, or they get caught, or they kill themselves. So Dr. Richard Badcock, and a consultant forensic psychiatrist who had worked with the police on loads of things, including Harold Shipman's case. But he believes that actually these crimes follow a distinctive pattern. He's unable to deal with, Fuller is unable to deal with his own issues, except through sadomasochistic behaviour. So the creeper burglaries that he starts in the 70s suggest that he starts with voyeurism, watching people breaking in, being in their personal space. He then escalates to sexual assault and murder. And Dr. Badcock sees a direct link then between the sexual homicides of Wendy and Caroline and the later offences in the mortuary, which is psychologically more extreme than murder. So for him, he sees this as an escalation. Where do you go from rape and murder? There is only one place to go. So 67-year-old David Fuller has admitted responsibility. I mean, he has lied consistently to the police about everything. And, they literally have to say to him, we've got your footprint, we've got your fingerprint, we've got your DNA. It's 1,000,000,000 to 1. And then he has admitted responsibility for killing Wendy Nell, 25, and Caroline Pierce, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce in 1987, but denies murder. So I guess he's going to say that it was an accident. He's known to have been abusing the deceased between 2008 and 2020, but there is a glaring hole in his record with no known offending between 1987 and 2008. But obviously, with all of those images and stuff that the police are going to have to go through, it's unlikely that there is no incidents during that time. So police are now looking into missing persons cases that would fit the time and location that could possibly be the work of David Fuller. And one of these is the murder of Linda Cook in 1986 in Portsmouth, which is about 92 miles away from Tunbridge Wells. The barmaid's body was found dumped on a wasteland just a mile away from where Fuller grew up and lived as a teen. So this case is known as the Cinderella murder because a distinctive footprint was left on the 24-year-old's body. So we now know that Fuller left a footprint at the scene of Wendy's murder. He knows the area. He grew up there. It's all unfolding right now. He was arrested and taken into custody and had his first court hearing on the 3rd and 4th, around then, beginning of December 2020, and he is in court now, and it's all coming out, and they are setting up support teams for all the families who are affected by this case, because there are hundreds. It's just horrendous, and it's wonderful that the murderer of these two women has finally been found, because it really rocked a whole community, and there were such young women, but it is open this horrendous investigation. I just cannot imagine having to be the people who have to go through all of these images and document them. How they're finding out who these deceased victims are is they are having to home in on the tags on the bodies so that they can contact their families. The whole thing is just horrendous. And that is the horrible, horrible story of the Bedsit murders. Now, hopefully he is going to go to prison for the rest of his life. What I discovered is one of those things that you never know that you're going to know. But the sentence for necrophilia is only 2 years. Whereas obviously if you murder someone, it's life. So I wonder if the law will get changed after this case, because he's obviously abused enough deceased people that I think his 2 years would add up pretty quickly to over a life sentence anyway. But 2 years does not quite seem enough. I'm very sorry that you had to listen to that. And maybe we'll do something a little bit cheerier next week. Thank you for all your comments on the Terry Jo Dupereau case and the Bluebell. What a badass girl. Loads of people have been messaging me saying, how the hell do you survive something like that? She's just incredible. And I love to hear your suggestions. So please, as always, either email us at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com or send us a message. You can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review. And I've just set us up with a little website. So you can find us at themondaynightrevue.blogspot.com. Remember that review is spelled REVUE, and on there you can find all our previous episodes. You can find a few book recommendations. You can find some Netflix recommendations. You can even buy me a coffee if you fancy it. But go and have a look, and I'll speak to you all next week. And until then, stay safe, be kind, and always check your back seat before you drive.